The other day I realized that I haven't done a tier list in a while and I love doing them. They're fun, they're casual, so obviously it's happening. Today I'm going to be ranking horror subgenres. At first I was thinking, are there even enough of them to make a whole tier list? But then I started writing them down and there are so many. Get comfortable, grab a snack for this video. And also let me know in the comments if there are any tier lists that you are dying to see from me. I've only done a couple in the past, but I definitely want to do more. So let me know what are the topics you would most like me to cover in a tier list format. So let me start by quickly going over the tiers because as you may know, I like naming them myself. The top tier is Dying for More. This is of course for my favorite subgenres, the ones where I'm always excited to see films in, and some of them are actually, in my opinion, underrepresented. So I need a lot more films in this favorite subgenre of mine. Then we have Worth Another Stab. This is also subgenres that I really like and would love to continue seeing movies in, but they're not just the very top tier of my horror preference, but still adore these subgenres. For my middle tier, I have Better Get Creative, and this is essentially the hit or miss category. This is for subgenres that I think are done pretty frequently and require something else to them to make them really interesting. The filmmakers need to get creative with these movies in order to make them actually stand out and truly shine. Next up is Over It. This is obviously the category for the subgenres that I think are overdone, and I am pretty over them. I am totally fine taking a break from these subgenres. I'm not a big fan to begin with, so yeah, that's pretty self-explanatory. And the last category is an actual nightmare for me to watch because this is for subgenres I actively hate. I have very few favorites within these subgenres, and I generally don't watch movies in them unless someone really strongly recommends them. So that is the tier situation, and let's get into these subgenres. I'm going to say the word subgenre 20 million times in this video, I'm pretty sure. So starting with slasher, this is a classic horror subgenre, and I have to say I have a very special place in my heart for slashers. So many of them are done lazily, and for every great slasher, there are like probably 10 terrible or mediocre slashers. So it's not really an amazing subgenre quality-wise, but I do have some big favorites within it, such as Scream, A Nightmare on Elm Street, classics, obviously, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, as you can see, represented on my shirt today. More recently, X, which is a great kind of Texas Chainsaw Massacre inspired slasher that just came out this year. Highly recommend if you haven't seen it. There are tons of slashers that I really like, but even more that are very lame. And for that reason, slashers are going into Better Get Creative category because let's be real, if they don't get creative with these slashers, if they're not doing something new and exciting, they're generally pretty similar and pretty boring. Next up, we have found footage, which is another subgenre that is often done very lazily, but can also be used very effectively and in a creative way. I used to think that I don't like found footage horror, and I know a lot of people don't like it. It's a pretty polarizing subgenre, but as I've discovered more gems within found footage, I have grown an appreciation for the subgenre. I love films such as Lake Mungo. You guys know I talk about Lake Mungo every chance I get, and I do have a video on this channel where I talk about some found footage movies that are worth your time. It's a couple years old, so I have found new favorites since then, but if you want a solid list of where to start with good found footage, definitely check that one out. Of course, the Blair Witch Project has to be on here. The more I watch Blair Witch Project, the more I appreciate it. Wreck is another great one. They remade it into an American film called Quarantine, which is not great, but the original Wreck is amazing. And I found a new appreciation for As Above, So Below recently. Literally a few days ago, I rewatched it for a random reason. I don't know why I decided to give it another chance because I really didn't like it on my first viewing. But then on the second viewing, I am glad I gave it a second chance because it really came together for me. It really worked. I understood what they were trying to achieve there. And I think it's actually a lot smarter than people give it credit for. So it's definitely one of my favorite found footage films now. But this is going in the better get creative category as well, along with the slasher, because as I've said, they are so lazy and lame most of the time. You really have to dig for those gems, and you really need someone who knows what they're doing and who uses the medium creatively in order to make these films stand out. Next up is crime and mystery, really combining crime and mystery with the horror genre and making it extra dark and extra twisted. These are films that generally walk the line between a dark thriller and a horror film, and sometimes people will argue whether it's a thriller or a horror film, but I love when those two genres come together. Movies like Seven, one of my all-time favorites, The Silence of the Lambs, American Psycho, and also if you haven't seen Cure, which is a Japanese crime horror film, oh my goodness, you need to check it out. It is so messed up, it is so creepy, and it is very, very satisfying. I love that film. Need to rewatch it. It's been a while. Check out Cure, and I'm putting crime horror into the worth another stab tier. As long as the mystery itself is good and is dark enough, it's going to be a really, really interesting horror film. Home invasion. I have never been a big fan of home invasion horror films. They just never do much for me, and there are some interesting entries in this subgenre, but overall, I'm not big on this subgenre, and I feel like it's done pretty often because I guess it's a common fear for people, so horror filmmakers capitalize on that, but they rarely make it interesting, at least from my perspective. I think the best example of using home invasion in a horror film is Jordan Peele's Us, which isn't your traditional home invasion movie, so that tells you how much I appreciate that genre. But in that movie, it is actually very, very interesting, and it's twisted and it's dark, and I really, really like it. I'm a big fan. The other one that I enjoyed a lot is Hush. That's a very popular one, and I think a lot of people enjoyed it. It's not my favorite horror film, but as far as home invasion goes, this is definitely at the top of my list. But other than those two, couldn't really think of anything that I truly, truly recommend. Let me know if you have any recommendations for me for home invasion that you think I would like, because I'm not a big fan of things like You're Next or The Strangers, all of that. It's not my thing. So this is obviously going into the overrated category. If they never made another home invasion movie, I would be totally fine with it. It's not that awful that I can put it in an actual nightmare, but I'm bored with it. I don't need it. I'm good. Next, I have survival horror. I wasn't even sure if I was going to put this as a subgenre because technically all horror, well, most horror is about surviving something. But what I'm talking about is people or a character being put in a situation they are not comfortable in, something extreme happens, and they have to do their best to survive. When I give examples, it'll make more sense. This works really, really well if the setting is interesting, or and hopefully both, if you have a great lead character you really want to root for, or a group of characters you're really rooting for. If you combine those two things, it's going to be a great survival horror film. I'm talking about stuff like The Descent, one of my favorite horror films. I actually rewatch it quite often, which is weird. It's a pretty terrifying movie and pretty uncomfortable to watch. Also movies like Green Room, you guys know I love Green Room. Cube, which is a little bit dated at this point, but it is a very interesting setting, and kind of hope they would redo this movie because it's a fun one to watch and it's definitely unique. I'm talking about movies like this where people are really doing their best to survive, and I think it's very interesting to watch. So I am putting this one in the worth another stab tier. Would love to see more true survival horror films. Body horror. This, I think, works the best when it's combined with another genre, such as body horror, but also a drama, or body horror, but also sci-fi. things like that. I think body horror on its own is a little bit one-dimensional and can get a little bit gross for the sake of being gross, which is not really my thing. But I love movies like The Fly, which is David Cronenberg, and he is the father of body horror films. Also things like Slither, which is a little bit underrated in my opinion. The Thing, which is definitely a sci-fi twist on body horror. So is The Fly, but The Fly is more body horror focused. And more recently, of course, Titan, an amazing French horror film. If you haven't seen it for some reason and you enjoy body horror, then absolutely check it out. It is weird and it is exactly what you need. So I'm going to put this in the better get creative tier because, as I mentioned, I do prefer when it's combined with other genres or when the body horror is meant to illustrate some point like it does in Titan. I think it just makes it more interesting, but the generic body horror, kind of hit or miss. Torture and gore, no thank you. There are a couple of exceptions for me, but this is one of my least favorite horror subgenres. The exceptions I'm talking about is Martyrs, which I still don't know how to rate that movie. It is weird. I do have a video on it if you haven't seen it. But Martyrs is that rare film that is very gory and there's definitely torture in it, but the point that it's trying to make and the idea transcends all of that gore and torture. The other obvious choice is Saw. It is a solid mystery horror film on top of being kind of a torture gore film, and I think the villain is interesting in the Saw franchise. I did quit on that franchise eventually because I think it devolved into something really not that interesting. But at the beginning, in the first few Saw films, I really was interested in Jigsaw as a villain, and I thought his perspective was an interesting one to bring into a horror film. So this is obviously going into the actual nightmare tier because no thank you. I will not be watching a lot more torture and gore films. Not my thing. Next is psychological horror, which is easily one of my favorite horror subgenres. I love it. It is fascinating. There's so much you can do with it. So I am putting it right into that dying for more category. I have only one complaint about psychological horror, and that is when they use a trope that is probably my least favorite trope in all of cinema. And when they use it as a twist, I want to throw something at the movie, and that is, it was all a dream. It was all in the character's head. Get out of here. I despise this trope. It makes me feel like I wasted my time watching this movie and feeling for these characters because none of it apparently happened. Well, movies are fake anyways, but none of it happened in the realm of the movie even. It's just no thank you. There are very few movies that can pull this off. There are some, but generally, if that happens as a twist, I get very, very angry. But the reason I love psychological horror is because A, I find it really effective most of the time, and B, it's just really versatile. You have classics like The Shining, you have something like Black Swan, you have things like A Tale of Two Sisters, and more recently you have things like Saint Maud. All of these are psychological horror. All of these are favorites for me, and I could probably make a top, 25 easily of my favorite psychological horror films because they are fantastic, and that is why it's one of my favorite subgenres. Next, kind of related to that, it can be at least, is asylum horror, and I wanted to keep this one separate because I really don't like asylum horror. It's just, I find that it's mostly done in bad taste most of the time, in my experience. Once again, depends on what you're watching, I guess. Maybe there are good ones that exist, but this is one of my least favorite horror subgenres. I can't even think of a favorite in this subgenre, and I haven't seen a ton of them, but every single one I've seen has annoyed me, and that is why it's going into the actual nightmare tier. The only example of asylum horror that I could think is not even a horror film because the only thing I could think of is Unsane, which is definitely a thriller and not a horror film. Yeah, that's where I am with Asylum. No thank you. Next up, cannibal horror. Also a no thank you for me. Just not a big fan of this. And the issue for me isn't just the fact that it's really gross. I can get past that if we're doing something interesting with it. I just don't think they do much interesting stuff with this subgenre. I think the cannibalism subgenre has peaked with Raw, which is a French masterpiece horror film. Same director as Titan, by the way. Can we find a connection there for the kind of movies I like? But I think Raw is a great example of how you can use cannibalism in a film and make it interesting. The other one that I really enjoyed is Fresh, which is an indie horror film that came out earlier this year. Highly recommended. I do believe it's on Hulu. But yes, Fresh I found really entertaining, really refreshing, no pun intended. And once again, it used cannibalism and flesh, so to speak, in a way that actually was making an interesting point. Other than those two, I cannot think of a single one that I enjoyed or found remotely interesting. So not a fan of things like Cannibal Holocaust or The Green Inferno. Just, why? No. Gross. So obviously, if this wasn't clear yet, into an actual nightmare tier it goes. Next up, revenge horror. Now this is something I can get behind. And this is another one of those subgenres that walks the line between a really dark thriller and an actual horror film. I think a lot of people argue about revenge horror films, whether they are horror or not, because the line is pretty thin, but I think really dark and extra twisted revenge horror films are fascinating. We're talking about things like I Saw the Devil, one of the best examples of that. Also something like Upgrade, which is a really fun film and a combination of futuristic sci-fi, but grounded sci-fi with a revenge horror film and a little bit, not a little bit, there's definitely an action twist to it. It's pretty unique. I'm a big fan of it. So this is going into the worth another stab tier, and I would love to continue seeing movies in this subgenre. Next up, comedy horror. Not a big fan. You guys probably know this. I'm generally not huge on comedies, which sounds weird. It's not like I don't like funny things. I just think that comedies these days try way too hard and the jokes are mostly really flat. Just not my taste. What can I say? But despite that, I do have some really big favorites in the subgenre. Of course, The Cabin in the Woods. You guys know I adore The Cabin in the Woods. Tucker and Dale versus Evil. I laugh so hard watching that movie every time. It is hilarious. Also, I don't think we can talk about comedy horror without mentioning Beetlejuice. Beetlejuice is an amazing example of this genre and a very beloved classic. And more recently, I am a big fan of Ready or Not. I did not expect that movie to be as good as it was, but it was genuinely a functioning horror film and a functioning comedy. This is what makes comedy horror work, in my opinion, because it's a very difficult balance to pull off. Make a film that is a comedy that is funny, but also a horror film that is still scary on some level and not just a gross comedy. And that is very, very difficult to pull off. But in general, this is just not a genre that I have a lot of interest in. And I think we need to take a break from it. I think we need to take a break and then come back with a true gem. And for that reason, I am putting it into the over it category. I just need horror movies to stop trying to be funny. Now, let's get into all of the supernatural stuff, starting with Haunted House. And yes, please, I really, really appreciate haunted house horror movies. I feel like it's a very old school genre that just isn't done all that much anymore. It is still done, but I feel like people have lost the appreciation for haunted houses and how cool those movies can be. This is the kind of subgenre where I might not love the movie I'm watching, but I still find something interesting about it. The atmosphere, the way it's shot, the creepiness, it appeals to me. But as far as my favorites go, of course, The Conjuring, the first one, I love the first two, but as far as haunted houses go, I think the first one fits that category the best, and it is terrifying and done really well. I'm a big fan. Also, The Orphanage, which is a fantastically creepy film, and The House at the End of Time, which is very underrated. I do not hear anyone talk about that movie forever. I don't think people have seen this movie. Like maybe a few people have seen it and I'm one of them, but generally I don't think people know this movie exists, and it's a really effective haunted house horror film. Now, this is of course going into my worth another stab tier. Would love to see more haunted house horror movies done, and we are moving on to gothic horror. Now, this is a huge favorite for me. These are generally movies that tend to be a little bit less scary, and it's all about the atmosphere and the dread, and they are gorgeous. They are kind of haunted house adjacent. I think there's a lot of crossover, but specifically gothic horror is just so delicious to watch. I don't know another word for it. It is delicious. It is creepy. It is aesthetically so pleasing, and the stories are usually so sad and dramatic. How can I not love them? Of course, you guys already know how much I adore Crimson Peak. I will defend that movie forever. I think it is so misunderstood. It is fantastic and also, of course, gorgeous, but a beautiful, beautiful gothic horror romance. Also, I'm a big fan of The Woman in Black with Daniel Radcliffe. That movie is underappreciated in my opinion. Yes, it does have some silly stuff in it, but it is once again a gorgeous and very dark and sad gothic horror film. And naturally, Sleepy Hollow, a classic, fun movie, a little bit goofy, but also a fantastic gothic horror film. So naturally, this is going into my dying for more category because I really do need people to make more gothic horror films, and I will watch them no matter the cast, no matter the director. I just need more of this subgenre in my life because it is stunning. Now, next is supernatural horror, and this unfortunately tends to devolve into jump scares, but there are some real gems. Once again, supernatural horror is a pretty classic genre of horror, and also something that has a lot of really iconic classic films in it, but I just don't feel like filmmakers know how to do it properly anymore. I'm not really trying to generalize. Obviously, gems exist and pretty recent gems too, but overall, it makes me really sad when you have a really cool supernatural horror concept and then all they do with it is jump scares and creepy things around the corner, and then, humans prevail. Yay. Movies I love within the subgenre: The Ring, of course. I adore The Ring. Also, Shudder, an amazing, amazing horror film. We're talking the original, not the remake. The Sixth Sense, I think, falls into this category, although it is a psychological horror film as well, but there is definitely supernatural. Also, It Follows, a great horror film that I rewatch quite a bit, and the original Candyman. This is something that is often dismissed as a slasher, but guys, I watched it pretty recently, right before the new Candyman came out, which is also a pretty good film. That movie holds up so well, and it is so creepy and so effective. Definitely one of the best examples of the blend of the slasher and the supernatural horror. But yes, unfortunately, films within the subgenre can be very hit or miss. And for me personally, I think just saying supernatural horror is the genre of this movie is not enough to pique my interest. I need to know more. So this is going into the better get creative category. Next, we have folk and mythology, and this is also easily one of my most favorite things in horror. I'm also counting witches, cults, urban legends, all of that fits into here, and these are some of my favorite things to see in a horror movie. You guys know some of my favorite horror movies of all time are The Witch, Hereditary, Midsommar, The Wailing. All of those fall under this category, and there are quite a few of them that are wonderful, and I need more made. I feel like it's a real missed opportunity when filmmakers don't tap into the dark side of folklore, which, let's be real, folklore is a pretty dark thing for the most part. So I need more of that. It's always unique and interesting, and that is why it is going into my dying for more category. Definitely an underrepresented subgenre, although they're doing it more and more now, which makes me very happy. Outbreak and zombies. Now, let me tell you, outbreak movies are the definition of me being over something because of the past couple years of the pandemic we had. I don't need another outbreak movie ever. And zombie movies, I used to think that I'm a fan of zombies, but then I realized I'm not, because once again, they don't do many interesting things with zombies. There are, of course, some exceptions, but for the most part, zombie movies are kind of very similar between each other. My favorite zombie films include Train to Busan, of course. I'm a big fan. That is probably my favorite zombie film of all time. 28 Days Later, of course, is a great outbreak/zombie movie, and Pontypool, very underrated. It is not a perfect movie. It has its issues and it's definitely low budget, but the way it treats the idea of zombies and outbreak and what it does with that is so unique and so interesting. You have to check it out if you can find it. Next are vampires, and you might remember vampires are my favorite supernatural creature. I will always watch a vampire horror movie. We're talking about horror movies, not other vampire movies that are not horror where people sparkle. I don't really have a good explanation as to why I like vampire horror. I just do. Let the Right One In is one of my all-time favorite films, not just horror in general. I also really do like Interview with a Vampire and Bram Stoker's Dracula. I'm just a fan. I can't explain it. Fright Night, of course, the original, not the remake. Not a fan of the remake, but the original is very nostalgic to me. It is a little bit 80s silly type of vampire stuff, but I do really love it. And an underrated gem, Thirst. Park Chan-wook's Thirst is a fantastic vampire horror film. If you haven't seen it, check it out. I might need to make a video on it because I feel like people are not watching it and they really need to. Werewolves. I thought I did not like werewolves, and the big issue I have with werewolves in horror movies is that they just look silly. I cannot get past the look. The technology just wasn't there, and I don't even know if it's there now. We'll see with Wolfman with Ryan Gosling if that is good, but I feel like they look comical and I cannot take these horror movies seriously at all. But I did see Ginger Snaps a couple years ago and I loved it unexpectedly. Amazing horror film. Also, The Wolf of Snow Hollow. Those two movies really are why I am more open to werewolf films in general, because I saw that they can be done in an interesting way. You just have to get creative, which is exactly where this subgenre is going. Get creative with it, because otherwise they're very hit or miss. Creature feature. This might be a hot take, but I find most of creature feature films boring. I mean, a big monster is attacking. Oh man, what's gonna happen in this movie? I wonder. Obviously, we have classics like Jaws and Jurassic Park, and yes, those are both creature feature horror films. Like, explain to me how they're not, if you disagree with that. I know it's a sore subject for a lot of people, and people have been arguing about this for years, but in my mind, I don't know how can you watch these and not think they're creature feature horror films. But yes, I adore both of these. Also, Bong Joon-ho's The Host, a fantastic monster horror film that actually has something to say. Fascinating in my opinion. And I do like A Quiet Place. It's a very well executed film and it has an element to it that makes it stand out next to other creature feature films. I guess Cloverfield would go here as well, which I do enjoy. It's not perfect, it's not amazing, but I watch Cloverfield more often than I care to admit. But other than those, I'm just not a big fan, and that's why it's going into the over it category. I could live without monster movies. I really could. Now, sci-fi horror is hands down my favorite subgenre of horror. And unfortunately, because probably budget reasons, there just aren't that many sci-fi horror films out there, at least compared to other subgenres. I feel like this is pretty underused as a subgenre. I don't care who's in it, once again, who's making this movie, what's it about. If it's sci-fi horror, I'm going to watch it just because it's within that subgenre. I adore Alien and Aliens, and you guys are probably tired of hearing that, but you know, they're some of my favorite movies of all time. Also, let's talk about Alex Garland. I love Annihilation and Sunshine. Sunshine was not directed by Alex Garland, but it was written by Alex Garland. Going back to the classics, The Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1978 is a fantastic sci-fi horror film. Love that one. There are so many more I could name, and including some of the ones that I mentioned earlier, because there is some crossover with the sci-fi genre in previous subgenres. But let's just go ahead and put it into the dying for more tier, because yes, please make more sci-fi horror. I am here for it. Next up, Possession. Now, it's not that I think that this is a genre that can't be done well. There are a lot of good possession-centered horror movies. This is just a genre I don't enjoy watching because possession makes me very uncomfortable. I don't like the idea of losing control of my body, and I don't like seeing body parts contorted in unnatural ways. It is very disturbing to me. I'm generally just uncomfortable watching possession horror films, and that's it. It's not a bad subgenre. I just personally really don't like it. I know there's going to be people who are going to tell me, well, isn't it the point of horror to scare you? Yes, it is, but if I am genuinely uncomfortable watching it, that's not fun anymore. It's not entertainment. It's just me watching something I don't want to be watching. So let's just stop that there. Possession horror that I like. Jennifer's Body. I think that movie is having a resurgence, and for good reasons. Get Out, which is not your traditional possession movie because it's not demonic possession, but if you think about it, a lot of it has to do with, how should I say this without spoilers if you haven't seen it yet, with losing control of your body for a reason. So yes, I would say it's kind of a possession horror film. Also, The Conjuring 2, obviously very much a possession horror film. And The Devil's Candy. Yes, I am aware there are classics in this subgenre. I'm just, like I said, I'm not a big fan. I'm very picky when it comes to possession horror movies, and I would be lying to you if I said that I rewatch The Exorcist regularly and it's like my favorite horror film. It's just not. It's a great film. It's just not my thing. So yes, possession is going into an actual nightmare because watching these is an actual nightmare for me, unless it's the ones I mentioned. Finally, last but certainly not least, superpower horror. This is, in my opinion, the most underdone subgenre of horror, and I don't know why. It is one of my favorites as well because I think a dark, twisted take on superpowers is just such a cool and appropriate concept. I mean, why isn't this done more often? And when it is done, and it's something like Brightburn, I just get very upset because why did you waste this opportunity? The idea was so cool. I went to see Brightburn in cinema, and I was very upset because it was such a waste of time and such a waste of concept. I'm irrationally angry at Brightburn's existence because they wasted it. They wasted a great concept. But of course, we have the classic Carrie. What a powerful, fantastic horror film. Then also we have Chronicle. I adore Chronicle, and it is also a found footage horror film, which is really good. Just combining those two in one. Why not? It's great. I think it's amazing. If you haven't seen it for some reason, check it out. And I guess Dr. Sleep is kind of within that subgenre. It is not a perfect film. I don't adore it. I think it has some issues. There's things about it that I really dislike. But overall, the superpower aspect of it, I think, is done really well. And I would absolutely rewatch it, even though it's not one of my favorites. It's a good example of the subgenre. Let's do more of those. I would love to see more. And if you have recommendations, please give them to me because I just don't feel like these films really exist all that much. But yes, superpower horror is going into my dying for more category because please give me more of those. And that is going to be my final horror subgenre. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Let me know what your favorite and least favorite horror subgenres are. Let me know if you think I missed any that I should have included, and where would you rank them, especially if they're your favorites. And of course, movie recommendations and tier list topic recommendations. Leave all of that in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I hope all of you are having a wonderful day, and I will see you very soon in my next video. Bye.